Good morning, everyone, or just good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Rabbi.
Just getting the technology bit set up. Get the YouTube over there. Get the handout here. Back to the text. How's everyone doing today? Oh, it says good afternoon on YouTube.
Okay.
Good to know you're out there. Give it a few more minutes. We have quite a smorgasbord of topics to cover. As usual, we'll end up delving deeply into just one of them, but it's hard to pick when you're doing Teitzei. Too many different topics.
Do they have restaurants anymore with smorgasbords?
Right now during COVID, I don't think there are a lot of places that are doing smorgasbord buffets, salad bars, and those kinds of things, since it's basically just a nice warm petri dish. But in terms of like smorgasbord, as it's
there used to be in La Mesa a Danish restaurant, and
Loretta, hi.
They had a smorgasbord. That's what they this.
Yeah, I think there are, or at least pre-COVID, there were still buffets. I don't know that they were all uniquely Scandinavian like the original term. But yeah, this has not been a good time for
that's
communal
what
eating.
I was wondering. I always felt a little when we went there.
Felt what?
A little Viking.
Ah.
You know, like
All right. Well, we've given our more or less usual buffer. So let's go ahead and get to work. So we are in Deuteronomy 24 for our study this morning. Remember, as I remind people from time to time, we cannot study the entire parasha in depth because we would need, well, basically a few hours every day to have even a hope of scratching the surface. But you should be reading the entire Torah portion. If you're not sure what the whole Torah portion is, you can go to Sefaria. It does have it broken down by parshiot. You can also go to Hebcal. Hebcal.com is a great website which gives you the whole Hebrew calendar breakdown for the entire year, when the holidays are, where they fall in the calendars, which readings we do for them. Together, really, that between Hebcal and Sefaria, you can stay on top of where we should be studying. But like I said a few minutes ago, Teitzei is a parasha that is chock full of different commandments, some of which are interconnected, some of which seem to be a little bit unrelated to one another. So we are going to go through a part here of chapter 24, and then we're going to hit our key commandment and delve into it in more depth. So let's hit chapter 24, verse 1 of the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. Where's my mouse? There we go. A man takes a wife and possesses her, or perhaps more clearly, when a man takes a wife and he has sex with her. The term there for possession is very misleading in the English. Clearly, the translators were going for a euphemism, but this is really more about intimacy between the man and wife, and it's simply talking about consummating the relationship. And if she fails to please him because he finds something obnoxious about her, very interesting word, right? Ervat davar, obnoxious is generally the way Judaism comes down to understand this halachically. The term could also simply mean licentious, but Judaism does not think that the Torah is talking only about misbehaving in a licentious manner, in a sexual way. It could be just about anything. So when there is a problem and he writes her a bill of divorcement, hands it to her and sends her away from his house. So all of this is a preamble to what's coming next. But as a preamble, it is also giving us a lot of information, telling us first and foremost that divorce is possible within Judaism. When you get married, although the commitment should be for eternity and is hopefully going to last that long, there are definite situations where divorce is the best solution. Generally speaking, it should not be treated as the first solution to marital problems. Conversation, discussion, adaptation, counseling, all of these things are important for trying to work out a relationship. But in the end, if divorce is necessary, divorce will happen. And the divorce happens by a formal process of writing and delivering a document known as a get, and something that is coordinated through a rabbi. So all of this happens, and now the wife has left the house. Verse 2, she leaves his household and becomes the wife of another man. She gets remarried, right? So this is, again, a very important distinction between some other faith traditions. When the husband and wife separate and she is divorced from him, she is allowed to remarry, as is he, I should point out. Verse 3, then this later man rejects her, writes her a bill of divorcement, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house, or the man, meaning the second husband that she has married, dies, right? So let's make sure we have the chain of events here. She's married to husband A, he divorces her, she gets married to husband B, he divorces or leaves her, either by divorcement or death. Now she is single again, right? So that's the situation we are in. Verse 4, then the first husband who divorced her shall not take her to wife again, since she has been defiled. Defiled, again, is a strong word in English. It simply means that she has been rendered unfit to be married to him, right? She has been desanctified vis-a-vis the first husband permanently. For that would be abhorrent to the Lord. You must not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage. Now, it's very important that we understand the distinction that's being made here. He was married to her, right? Mr. A was married to her, then divorced. She marries now Mr. B. He divorces her or dies. She is now single again. She cannot go back to marry Mr. A, right? She cannot return to her first husband after she has been married to a second husband. Now, why is this considered an abhorrent practice? Why is this something that is a toeva, to use the Hebrew? Because if you allowed that practice, then there would be no reason to ever worry about willing adultery, right? You could do spousal swapping, all perfectly legal and above board. All you would have to do would be to divorce, get married to someone else. And remember, Jewish marriages only take about 5 to 10 minutes. Do the act, get divorced from that second person, and go home with the guy that you came with. That would be legal if it were not for this passage. right? That would be a fundamental problem, and in a sense, making a mockery of what marriage is. Right? Marriage is not something you're supposed to put on and take off like a cloak. It is something that you are supposed to be in as a committed relationship and leave as a commitment that that relationship is no longer going to work. And to allow this back and forth would create a snarl of problems. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions on that issue? All right. Verse 5, we already saw as a hint in our conversation of who goes out to war in last week's discussion. When a man has taken a bride, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He shall be exempt 1 year for the sake of his household, to give happiness to the woman he has married. We talked about that much more last time, so I'll refer you to that video. Verse 6, new topic. A handmill or upper millstone shall not be taken in pawn, for that would be taking someone's life in pawn. So in the ancient world, you would have millstones that you would have at home. And that's what they're talking about for grinding your grain in order to make flour, in order to actually make bread, to survive. Or sometimes there would be a larger mill rock, and then there would be the stone that would be on top of it that was the movable part, where you couldn't take the whole rock as a pawn or as a pledge for a loan. So the thought would be to take the movable rock, because that would render the rest of it as no longer usable. So you would know that they would definitely pay up because you had them by the throat. The Torah says, no, certainly taking objects as collateral for a loan is allowed, but you are not allowed to take an object for collateral that would render it impossible for the person to eat. That simply is inhumane. And as appropriate as it is to have loans and have them be secured by collateral, in many cases, this type of collateral is not allowed. Questions before we jump to another topic? Going once, going twice. Okay. Verse 7. If a man is found to have kidnapped a fellow Israelite, enslaving him or selling him, the kidnapper shall die. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. So kidnapping is a capital offense in Jewish law. There's not much more to say about that. It's simply a capital offense. Verse 8. In cases of a skin affection, be most careful to do exactly as the Levitical priests instruct you. Take care to do as I have commanded them. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the journey after you left Egypt. So verses 8 and 9 are trying to remind us of the issue of tzara'at, which we've talked about before as the skin affliction, often called leprosy. Should be like prints, right? The skin affliction formerly known as leprosy. Of course, it's always been known as tzara'at. It was only later translators that made that incorrect connection. But we have to be careful with this. We have to follow their rules on tzara'at. We follow doctors' rules for anything that is not tzara'at. And you shouldn't think that this can't happen to you or that you're above it, because remember, God even caused this to happen to Miriam when she spoke out against her brother and his family, her brother being Moses. Verses 10, there we go, sorry. When you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you must not enter his house to seize his pledge, right? If it's secured by collateral, that's fine, but you're not allowed to go into his house to take the collateral. If there is a definite case and there is proper documents that show that this is indeed collateral, the court can arrange this. But we do not allow people to go around kicking down the doors of the debtors to seize the property from them. You must remain outside while the man to whom you made the loan brings the pledge out to you. If he has a needy man, you shall not go to sleep in his pledge. 13, you must return the pledge to him at sundown, that he may sleep in his cloth and bless you, and it will be to your merit before the Lord your God. So the issue for all of these loan topics is to try and provide a measure of dignity and humanity in relating between creditor and debtor. This is not a world where you had large banks that would be impersonal. This is a place where you would be borrowing most likely from your neighbor or someone else in the town that you knew in order to help you through a difficult patch in your current harvest or work season. The notion about the pledge that's being taken to secure a loan, that would be your cloak. Remember, in the ancient world, many people did not own multiple sets of clothing or separate bedding. They would go to sleep in the cloak that they wore during the day when it was cold. Taking that as a secured loan when it was warm and during the day, yes, but at night you had to give it back, just like the millstone, to prevent actually causing additional harm through the guaranteeing of a loan. Right? Loans were always designed to help someone lift themselves up. Since you cannot take interest and benefit from the loan, it was never intended to enrich the one that is the creditor. So we're not looking out for their profit. We are looking out for the dignity of the person who has been given the loan. But simultaneously, do remember that Judaism expects the loan to be repaid. That as these are not big impersonal banks that are making the loan, but your neighbor or other community member, you have an obligation to pay back your loan as well, and the court will make sure that they get what is fair to come to them. Sorry, verse 14, continuing on with how we treat each other humanely in our economic forms. You shall not abuse a needy or destitute laborer, whether a fellow countryman or a stranger in one of the communities of your land. You must pay him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is needy and urgently depends on it. Else he will cry to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Right? Judaism believes in prompt payment. Prompt payment means when it was agreed upon. The Torah here is using the most vulnerable category to give us the strength of this commandment, meaning that somebody who works day by day and is only hired for a day at a time, you cannot wait to pay him the next day. You have to give him his wages that day, because such people in this society would use the money they made each day to buy the food they would eat that day. And if they went without payment, well, it could have been that they had missed work for a few days, but been unable to find it. And therefore, this may be the last time they have to get food before they starve. So you have to consider paying the person as though you are saving them from starvation by paying them on time. So if you keep the money longer than the agreed upon portion, then that would be considered a form of theft. Now, in all of this, of the different loan issues in particular and the salaries and wages, hopefully you're all noticing that a lot of this is probably going to depend on the record keeping, on what you can establish as who owed whom what and when was it intended and what was it secured by as collateral. All of those details would be essential for a fair resolution of any of these topics, which is why it is not entirely surprising that verse 16 comes as it does. Just a second. Parents shall not be put to death for children, nor children be put to death for parents. A person shall be put to death for his own crime. Wait a minute, you're saying, Rabbi, why is that coming here? What does that have to do with the issues of debting, of being in debt, or of paying a person at the proper time, or of millstones? This seems like a very different comment. In fact, it seems like such a different comment that it doesn't quite reconcile with what we know from the earlier parts of the Torah, where it says that God will remember the iniquity of somebody to their children and grandchildren and third and fourth generations. This sounds like that doesn't happen. So not only does it seem off topic, it also seems to be in contradiction to other parts of the Torah. And in case you're not figuring this out, we are indeed getting on to our topic here that is going to be the focus of our main study. So let those questions percolate a little bit, but before we dive into verse 16, I want to know if there's any questions about the topics that were handled before it. All right, then let's take a look at parents not being put to death for their children and vice versa. According to Sefer HaChinuch, one of our favorite resources, that a relative not testify one about the other. Now you may be thinking that's a completely different commandment. No, this is indeed the interpretation according to classic halakha, classic law, of what verse 16 means. We have been commanded not to accept the testimony of some relatives about some relatives. About this, it is stated in Deuteronomy 24:16, parents shall not be put to death for children, nor children be put to death for parents. And concerning this came the traditional understanding, Sanhedrin 27b, fathers should not be put to death based on the testimony of the sons, and sons should not be put to death based on the testimony of the fathers. And the same is true of financial cases, that we do not believe some relatives about some relatives. However, it is mentioned regarding laws of death sentences by way of hyperbole, that we would not say, since this is causing the loss of life, we should not suspect the relative about him, but rather follow his testimony, since his testimony is to lose the life of his relative. All right, so let me just sum up that in more modern English. The verse of parents not being put to death for their children is understood to mean on account of their children's testimony, and vice versa, right? An adult child cannot testify against their parents, and an adult parent cannot testify against or on behalf of a child. The reason why it focuses on the death penalty cases is because we would perhaps naturally assume more objectivity in the testimony of a person against a parent when it comes to a death penalty case, because no one could imagine that you would actually testify against your parents knowing that they will lose their life if your testimony is believed. But
Rabbi,
yes,
but in a death penalty case, there would be more pressure to get the testimony and the desire to get a conviction. The relatives of the deceased want to see somebody penalized for their child or their relative's death. So they would pressure another family to say, you know something, you need to testify. And this is a privilege, and this doesn't permit the court to pressure to get testimony that otherwise they couldn't get.
Yes, although again, remember in a death penalty case in Jewish law, it's not about gathering circumstantial evidence. So unless the child or other relative, as we'll see, was an actual witness to the actual murder, their testimony, even if it had been, I saw my dad buy a knife, I saw my dad talk about killing Mr. Cohen, I saw my dad coming home with blood on the knife, none of that would be sufficient evidence to execute the father for having as a murderer. So the testimony of a person in a death penalty case here is very much the eyewitness testimony to the murder. So unless they thought the relative was present at the murder, their testimony would not be germane to a capital case in any event. And as that issue of, is it only for children and parents or is it broader? It mentions sons and father by way of an example, saying that though one loves the other very much, and the Torah stated that also they are not believed, that one should condemn the other, and there is no need to say exonerate him. And the same is true of the other relatives, as the tradition about them has come to us, and we shall mention them in the laws of the commandment with God's help. I'll get you the list in just a second. But the issue here is, why specify parent and child? Because that is where the bond of love would be assumed to be strongest. And even there, we won't accept their testimony against. And of course, even there, we wouldn't accept their testimony to exonerate, because obviously we would be more likely to think that they would be misleading the court in order to help their relative. But in truth, for any of the close relatives, which we'll talk about in a second, the law is the same, that we do not accept their testimony against them, and we do not accept their testimony on behalf of them. If we scroll down, we can see indeed how Sifrei derives this. right? From fathers shall not be put to death by cause of sons, and sons shall not be put to death by cause of fathers, we learn that they, meaning relatives, do not testify against each other. We thus infer that to secure testimony against an inciter to idolatry, for example, witnesses are sequestered against them, right? We want to make sure that we have isolated testimony from each person, that they are not working together to collaborating. They're not collaborating in their testimony against someone. And from the rest of that verse, as it focused in, father should not be put to death by cause of sons. What is Scripture coming to teach us? The intent is rather that fathers shall not be put to death by testimony of sons, and sons by testimony of fathers. All right, so the first one, to recognize they don't testify against each other, and thus testimony needs to be unconnected one to another, meaning all witnesses should be sequestered. And the focus on why fathers and sons are mentioned is to tell us this basic idea of relatives don't testify against relatives or on behalf of relatives. And Choshen Mishpat from Shulchan Aruch gives us the explanation. The following are rules of disqualification. These are people that cannot provide testimony. Brothers, whether paternal or maternal, are first connections to first connections. Their children are second to second, meaning cousin to cousin, right? Their grandchildren are third to third. And I always forget how this works in the genealogy, but I believe that's first cousin once removed? Or is that the definition of second cousin, for those of you who are more genealogy buffs? All right, what would you call the grandchildren of separate lines to each other?
First removed. Once removed.
Once removed. Okay.
They're once removed.
That's what I thought. So they're first cousins once removed. So that's the category that that branch, right? Brothers, cousins, and the first cousin or the once removed are all unable to testify against each other. And going up the branch is also not allowed, right? A third with a first is always valid, and certainly a third with a second is valid, right? So meaning that a first cousin once removed to you could testify against somebody who was not connected to him, but in the first generation, and vice versa. And a second, however, and certainly a second and a first are disqualified. Therefore, for example, a grandfather with his grandsons is disqualified because a father and son are a first, just like a person with his brother, right? Father to son, you're only one generation removed. Therefore, you are first to first. And then going to the second, that's the next generation of what would be called a grandchild, is technically still like testifying against your uncle, which would not be allowed. It's confusing, I know, right? The basic idea is how many generations removed are you from the person? And recognizing that a father counts, a grandfather counts as like a father's brother as being close, or anyone in the grandfather's proximity. A great-grandfather with his great-grandson is valid because it is a third with a first. Now we have finally moved out of that first, second rung into a third rung. And now, yes, technically a great-grandfather could testify against a great-grandson or on behalf of, and vice versa. There has to be a limit eventually to what relatives can testify, because otherwise no one could testify against anyone because we're all from the same family originally. And especially if you lived in a small town, it would not be hard to get everybody related, and then you'd have no one able to testify against anyone, which wouldn't always be a problem, but sometimes you do need actual testimony. All right, so set that to one side. If you have any questions about it, let me know later. The precise way you measure the generations I know is confusing, but it is the levels of immediacy that are most disqualified. Most of the time nowadays, it's pretty straightforward and unusual to get second and third cousins coming up to testify, but certainly for the people that you would expect, parents, siblings, children, spouses are not allowed to testify, neither for good nor against. All right, don't go too far. The Torah refers to testimony given by the children. The same applies to fathers testifying against their children. The same is true of testimony of any blood relation being insufficient to base a death sentence on, as we just talked about. It is a decree by the Torah that such testimony is inadmissible, not only on behalf of relatives, but also against them, as we've described. Rabbeinu Bachya, as usual, giving us a lovely summary. Ibn Ezra gives us a little bit more of a sharp summary. A few confused souls have inquired how it can be that Scripture asserts fathers must not be put to death on the testimony of their children, whereas elsewhere, namely back in the Ten Commandments, it says, remembering the sins of the fathers, Exodus 20. But their question is foolish. Ibn Ezra was not known for mincing words. Fathers must not be put to death is a commandment addressed to Israel, meaning to us, whereas remembering the sins of the fathers applies to the rememberer, capital R, meaning God, as I have already explained in his commentary on Exodus 20, which you can look up on Sefaria. But this is the issue that I want to go into a little bit more depth on, right? Because how do we understand and reconcile between not taking the testimony of a child against their parent and vice versa, with the idea that the transgressions of a parent seem to have an impact and effect upon the child? And Ibn Ezra is laying out the basic ground rule that many of our commentaries are going to follow, which is that when it says you cannot make a child responsible for the parent in terms of their sin, in the more plain meaning of our text, rather than the testimonial meaning we've used so far, that is talking about what Israel and its courts can do. But when we talk about God remembering, well, God plays by a different set of rules. And as we're going to see, that is why we're going to see in our next commentary how that works out. First from Chizkuni, and children must not be executed for the sins of the fathers. The Torah addresses itself to the courts, meaning while human courts are not permitted to do this. But while human courts are not permitted to do this, the Lord, who knows what is in our minds at all times, is permitted to do so as when he does so. He does so because it is in the best interest of those who are treated thus, right? That when God does punish someone for prior sins of a prior generation, it is the appropriate action. Don't worry, we're going to go into much more detail on that. Basically, whenever God does so, he had waited for generations, for the new generation to become better than their fathers and grandfathers. None of these children and grandchildren would ever have been born if God had punished their sinful parents and grandparents instead of extending his mercy for 2 more generations. They are therefore being punished for their own sins, not for the sins of their parents. So Chizkuni is taking the approach used by many of our sages that God holds in abeyance the punishment for the sins of a particular generation, waiting to see if the next generations will follow in the footsteps of the first. And if they do, then the weight of those multiple generations comes crashing down and the punishment is extended. On the other hand, if they don't, then the punishment for the prior generation misses them entirely. This is the whole idea behind how God would eventually end up with the exile from Israel during the time of the northern tribes, the Assyrians, and the southern tribes and the Babylonians, because God had been sending prophet after prophet after prophet to try and steer the nation back. And in almost every generation, they refused to be corrected. And in almost every generation, they repeated the sins of the previous generation. Thoughts, comments? It's a difficult topic. It's, theologically very hard to try and wrap our head around. All right. So Sforno is going to go back to this idea of not killing a person for what their parents did. Again, taking a more pshat, a more plain reading rather than our testimonial reading. And he says, even if the crime involved was insurrection against the established authority, meaning a king or some other lord, it has been widely accepted, meaning you don't murder the kids because of their parents' rebellions. It had been a widely accepted rule that kings would also execute the family members of rebels in order to ensure that surviving relatives of such executed rebels would not form an active opposition to the king as a result of their grievances. Such matters are referred to in Isaiah 14, prepare a slaughtering block for his sons because of the guilt of their father. Let them not arise to possess the earth, then the world's face shall be covered with towns. In any event, the Torah prohibits kings, Jewish kings, from killing one person as a substitute for another. This is part of God's pity for members of his people. So the basic idea here is, and throughout human history, whether it's in the Middle East or every other continent, is that it has become almost a norm that when somebody takes power or when their power is threatened, they will kill not only their enemies, but kill the family of their enemies to prevent those families from becoming active rebels against them in the future. And what the Torah is telling us here is, no, you cannot kill a family just because of some of the rebels connected to that family. God has prohibited us from behaving this way. Questions or comments on that topic, which unfortunately remains germane in many of the lawless parts of our world? This notion of having restraint and not attacking fully and causing death of all is also connected in the Midrash for Moses and his relationship with God. You shall offer it terms of peace. This was from Deuteronomy 20 last week. Rabbi Levi said, Moses did three things and the Holy One, blessed be he, agreed with him. And these are them, meaning Moses took the initiative three times and God agreed with what Moses did on those three times. And these are them. It is written, Exodus 34, visit the iniquity of the fathers upon children. But Moses said, Deuteronomy 24, fathers will not be put to death for children. And from where do I know that the Holy One, blessed be he, agreed with him? As it is stated in 2 Kings 14, but he did not put to death the children of the assassins, in accordance with what is written in the book of the Torah of Moses. All right, so just a quick analysis of the how they're reading the text here, right? Visit the iniquity, we know originally was what was said earlier on. Deuteronomy has the feeling, most of it as being Moses's own words, certainly conveying God's intent, but what the rabbi is reading here is reading it very literally, that these were just Moses's words in contradiction to what God had said before. That God had said, yes, you could punish the children for what the parents did. Moses says, no, you shouldn't. And we know that God agrees because in the 2 Kings, the king decides not to murder the children of an assassin, because it was written, don't do that in the book of the Torah of Moses. Not only just the Torah, but by giving it the attribution of Moses, that verse in Book of Kings is showing that it was because of Moses's editing that we ended up not having this idea of killing whole families because of the crimes of the parents. Everyone follow that textual logic? Okay. And the second, where Moses did something and God agreed, was when he broke the tablets. I'm not going to go into great detail on that, but it's generally assumed that when Moses broke the first set of the Ten Commandments, God was, on the whole, pleased with that action, and then wrote the second set together with Moses. And the third was in the days of Sihon and Og. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, go out and fight with him, block his aqueduct, basically wage total war. But Moses did not do so, as it is stated in Deuteronomy 2:26, and I sent messengers. Right? He didn't just attack, there were messengers sent at first. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, by your life you have done as is fitting, and I agree with you. Therefore Moses warns Israel and says to them, when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. And throughout, we really do see Moses consistently being an advocate for patience, an advocate for limited engagement so as not to cause undue death or suffering. And what the rabbi is trying to say here is that these were all principles that were reinforced with God's agreement. We can wonder why God did not state it at first. Personally, I would think that the people in the earliest generations would not have been willing to abide by this, as the drive for vengeance is so strong. But thanks to Moses' leadership, we were able to move ourselves in a better direction, more in keeping with God's actual spirit. But we still have this issue, still wrestling with how do we see the relationship between parents and children and their sins? Fine, we've established they can't testify against each other. Limited human courts, what can we do? We don't really know what's in each person's heart. With a family member, we can't assume that they are being honest for all the different possibilities of bias that may be in that family. Okay, we cannot actually punish the next generation for what the parents did. That would go against a more peshat reading of the Torah. And we even see that bad kings were willing to follow this rule and not kill the children of assassins. But we still have, or at least I still have in the back of my head, that little buzzing of, but God can. That God can punish the children of prior generations for the sins of prior generations. And that may be all right for us to say, well, God can do what God wants to do because God is God and God knows what's right and God knows what's wrong. And while I certainly believe that, I also believe that God wants us to know what is right and what is wrong and why God does what God does to the best of our ability to understand it. And that, of course, is reinforced by the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God comes to Abraham and says, I have to talk to you about this because you and your kids are going to be the champions of justice. You need to understand to the best of your ability. So I'm not surprised that the Talmud doesn't let this topic go without further discussion. And so that's what we're going to finish off with. Again, this is from the Sanhedrin 27b. Let me get ourselves in position there. All right. And are children not to be put to death for the sin of the fathers? But isn't it written, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, right? From Exodus 34:7. This is our contra text from our Deuteronomy text versus the Exodus text. This is creating the tension that needs resolution. The Gemara answers, there, meaning this topic in Exodus 34, is where the children adopt the actions of their ancestors as their own. As it is taught in a Braita, one of the earlier rabbinic teachings, the verse, and also in the iniquities of their father shall they pine away with them, Leviticus 26, is where they adopt the actions of their ancestors as their own, right? So what's being discussed in verse 34 is specifically where they applaud, where they appreciate, where they embrace the sins of their ancestors. Even if they are not committing them to the same degree, even if they can't commit them to the same degree, if they wish they could, and if they celebrate those sins as being appropriate, then they are held as guilty as the ancestors, and the punishment continues to them. In modern examples, we could say, neo-Nazis or people who are rampant members of the KKK, they probably glorify the Holocaust or the Jim Crow persecutions and lynchings that took place in this country, even if by law and by opportunity, they cannot engage in the same. People such as those who say, my grandfather was so good for all of the horrible things he did that I think are great, those people are embracing the sins of the past. And by embracing them and attaching them, they are opening themselves up to be part of those that would be punished for behaving in such a manner. When it states every man shall be put to death for his own sin, in our own text, as well as also reinforced in Ezekiel, the Torah explicates that one is not put to death if he did not sin. The Gemara asks, and are they not? Really? Are you sure we don't execute them? But isn't it written, they shall stumble one upon another, right? Don't we know in Leviticus that actually people do bring each other to death? And one person who does something wrong can indeed cause another person to die? One, due to the iniquity of another, which teaches that all Jews are considered guarantors of one another, right? Aren't we all binding guarantors, right? Remember we talked about taking in pledge a collateral. Aren't we collateral for each other? So if Mr. Cohen commits a sin, doesn't Mr. Levi have to be punished for it? Because I'm the guarantor, I'm the co-signer of his behavior, because we are all linked together. Wouldn't that imply then that if Mr. Cohen was guilty of something that was deserving of death, that me, the co-signer for his behavior, would also be guilty of that same crime? The Gemara answers, the reference, meaning of guarantor for one another, is to a case where others had the ability to protest, but they did not protest. So yes, we are guarantors, we are the co-signers of their behavior when we see it and we do nothing. Meaning that if we see somebody engaged in a transgression, engaged in an action where they are committing a sin, and we don't say, hey, that's not right. If we don't say that's wrong, if we don't say stop, then indeed we have co-signed off on their behavior. We are now giving implicit agreement to what they are doing. We are implicitly opening the way for them to continue. And therefore, yeah, we are guilty of what they are doing because it was within our power to stop them or to at least protest, and we chose not to. So this whole idea of not being able to testify against each other is in the end flipped on its head, in that the actions of others that we choose to ignore becomes testimony against us. All right, questions and comments.
Comment first on what you finished with. That explains well the case at the end of Judges with the Judean traveler and the Benjaminites who don't do anything, really. And when I've been keep on looking, when we've been going through this discussion, the verse right before 16, which is, he will cry to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if Mr. Cohen screwed a bunch of laborers, had a heart attack and dies, his son then inherits Mr. Cohen's considerable wealth, knowing that there are these laborers out there who are crying to the Lord and does nothing. It then becomes his problem because he's been enriched by his father's misdeeds and he doesn't seek to remedy it.
Well, and so indeed, right, the property that he is enriched by has a lien against it by the laborers. So that portion of the property which is their due is technically not his property. If he holds on to it, he is holding on to theft.
Right, and then finally, the verse from Ezekiel, which is, a child shall not suffer for the iniquity of his parent, or a parent suffer the iniquity of his child. The righteous of the righteous shall be his own, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be his own.
Right. And all of this is, of course, a very important concept throughout Judaism, of this idea of individual responsibility, but also collective responsibility to ensure individual responsibility. That we can't simply say, hey, it doesn't bother me, it doesn't affect me, So what if the guy next door is, beating his wife? So what if the guy in the next cubicle is stealing from the company? So what if that person, she's cheating on the test? It's, not my business. I see that it's happening. I could say something, but why should I get involved? Once you have seen it, you have an obligation to be involved. And if you want, you could even say that God has put you in the position to be able to see that so that you will be involved. And if it is in your power to speak out or to stop, and you choose not to, then you are tacitly saying you agree with that continuing. And that means you are now responsible for it.
And that's also, to finish up, that's at the end of Proverbs. Speak for the destitute.
Right. I mean, and constantly, and indeed, if we had more time, I would have gone through the other verses just coming after where we stopped with verse 16 that talk about not oppressing the stranger and others. And in particular, these are people that have no one to stand up for them. They have no relatives or close family connections or close friends in the area because they are new or because their family has passed away or other reasons. And therefore, they are especially vulnerable to being taken advantage of in these situations. And that's why we are given a special admonition not to harm those people. All right. Any other questions or comments, or we'll wrap it up for today? All right. So just remember, if you see it, God wanted you to see it so that you could say or do something about it. Just keep that in mind. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.